All right, welcome back, students. And as usual, we have started our YouTube videos over what we're going to be talking about the next day in class. We will be talking about angle relationships in class tomorrow, and we're going to start with classifying angles. So we have a little vocabulary words here. We have congruent angles, vertical angles, adjacent angles, complementary angles, and supplementary angles. Okay? Congruent angles are angles that have the same measure. And we know from our previous knowledge that congruent means equal. So these angles have equal measurements. Okay, so I'm going to draw an example of two congruent angles. Okay. We have that angle. And I'm going to draw this one going this way. But I can tell it's congruent by that little symbol there. So these are going to be equal. Okay, so I could say this is 20 degrees. And I could say this is 20 degrees. These are congruent angles because they have the same measure. Okay. Vertical angles. Vertical angles are the opposite angles formed by two intersecting lines. Okay. Now intersecting means they're going to cross. Okay. And the opposite we know is across from, or in this case, you'll see when we do the intersecting here. All right, let's go here. Here's an example of intersecting angles. Here, intersecting lines, excuse me. These are vertical angles. So the opposite angles are formed by two intersecting lines, okay? Now, vertical. This angle here and this angle here would be vertical. Okay, so if I were to say this angle measurement was 75 degrees, this angle here would also be 75 degrees. Okay, now we know that a straight line is 180 degrees. So I could fill out this angle measurement here by looking at this straight line. So I would need this angle to be 105. So if this one is 105, this is the angle that's vertical to it. So it's also going to be 105. Okay. So these are opposite angles formed by intersecting lines. That's vertical angles. Okay. Adjacent angles are pairs of angles that share a vertex and one side, but they don't overlap. Okay, so now adjacent angles, they're going to be side by side and they do not overlap. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of what's not adjacent. Then I'm going to give you an example of what is adjacent. Okay, so these two angles here would not be adjacent simply because it says that there are pairs of angles that share a vertex and one side, but they don't overlap. So they don't share the vertex and they don't share the side here. All right, so these two would not be adjacent. Okay. So I could say this is angle A, this is angle B. So these would not be adjacent. Okay. Now let's get an example of what is adjacent. Okay. These two would be adjacent because they do share a common vertex and they share this common line, this common side there. So that's adjacent. So adjacent angles are beside each other. They're right beside each other. Okay. But they do not overlap. Okay. And they share the same vertex. Okay. Complementary angles. Complementary angles are two angles whose measures have a sum of 90 degrees. Now, I've always taught my students how to remember the difference between complementary and supplementary angles. Okay, complementary angles. Now, when you give someone a compliment, which is not this type of compliment, because compliment that I'm talking about, when you give someone a compliment, say your hair is pretty, that starts with has an I in it. Okay, so the way to remember this is when you give someone a compliment, it's the right thing to do. And we know that a right angle has a sum of 90 degrees. So compliment, two angles whose measures are a sum of 90 degrees. Okay. I also have them remember that if you take that C and write it down and draw a line, it forms a 9. So it'll be 90 degrees. Okay. Complementary angles. Okay. See, if I drew a right angle, okay, I would say that angle 1 and angle 2 would be complementary. Okay, and it denotes that with this little box here. We know that this is a right angle. We know right angles are equal to 90 degrees. So angle 1 plus angle 2 would give me 90 degrees. And I'm going to write that here. So angle 1, and that's how we denote an angle, plus angle 2 is going to give me 90 degrees. Okay. All right, now we have supplementary. Supplementary angles are two angles whose measures have a sum of, that's supposed to be 180 degrees. Okay, they have a sum of 180 degrees. So these are, I call supplements fat. Okay, so supplement, I always tell my students to take that S, and if I draw a line, it forms an 8, 180 degrees. Supplementary. Okay. Also, another way you can remember it is the alphabet. C comes before S, and 90 comes before 180. So that's how you can remember the difference between those two. Okay. Let's draw a supplementary angle here. So if I were to draw, we know that a straight line is 180 degrees. Okay. Now I'm going to draw. I have an angle here. This one's 70 degrees. Okay, so I know that they have to have a sum of 180. Okay, if I have 180 and subtract 70, it's going to leave me with 110. Okay, so I can say 110 plus 70 is going to give me that 180 degrees. So these two angles here are supplementary. This angle here, this obtuse angle, and this acute angle here. These two angles are equal to 180 degrees. All right, let's go over on the inside where we have angle pairs and one-step equations. Now, we've done one-step equations before, and one-step equations only have one operation. Okay, so we have a diagram here with different angle measurements. I hope you can see that with the written through the outside there. Okay, we're going to name a pair of vertical angles, and we're going to name a pair of adjacent angles. And we know that vertical angles are across from each other. Okay. And adjacent angles are beside each other. All right, so let's start with the vertical angles. Okay, so let's find two angles that are across from each other. Okay, let me try to draw this over to where you can see this a little bit better. Okay, that's a little bit better. That's 9 degrees there. Okay. All right, so now we're going to be looking at a pair of vertical angles. All right. Let's start with AEC. Okay, let's look at angle AEC. E, C. Okay, and we know that vertical means it's going to be across from it. So, across from that is B, E, D. And the way we're going to write that, remember that when you're trying to name angles, you need to denote it with the angle symbol. So angle A, E, C, and angle B, E, D. Okay? Those two are vertical angles. All right, so now let's look at adjacent angles. Adjacent angles are going to be angles that are beside each other, sharing the same vertex and the same side. Okay? All right, so let's look at, let me pick an angle here. How about BEF? BEF. Okay, let's pick an angle that's beside it. How about AEF? Okay, so those two are adjacent. So angle BEF and angle AEF. And as you see, they share the same side. So look at that, EF, EF. Okay. Okay. Before we move on, we're going to solve for X here. Okay. Now, this is where the one-step equation comes in. All right. We know that this angle right here is 90 degrees. And we know this is a straight line here. So and we know a straight line is 180 degrees. Okay. Now, if this is 90 degrees here, then these two angles here would have to be 90 degrees. So now I can write me an equation here to figure out what X is. I can say 60 plus X equals 90. Okay. Now I'm going to solve this just like I would a one-step equation. And remember, I would always part my river, trying to get this X by itself. So I'll use inverse operations. I'm adding 60. So now I have to subtract 60 from both sides. Because remember, whatever I do on one side, I must do to the other. And I'm left with X over here. So X would be 30 degrees. Okay. Now we're going to move on to angle pairs and two-step equations. Now, with two-step equations, we know that we have to do two operations. So in this problem here, we're trying to find the measure of RST. We're trying to find this measure here. But in order to do that, we have to first solve for X. Okay. Now we know that this straight line here is going to be equal to 180 degrees. Okay. So we know that on this side, we're going to have 180 degrees. Okay. Our next step is we're going to do 36 and 3x. We know that if this whole line is 180, these two together have to equal that 180. Okay. So we're always going to write it in y-intercept form, which would be 3x plus 36 equals 180. So now I'm ready to solve this just like I would the other problem. I start with parting my river. Okay. Now, anytime you see a variable and a coefficient in front of it, I'm going to have two operations. All right. So now I need to subtract 36 from both sides. Okay, give you a second to do that subtraction there. Okay, when you did that subtraction, you should have gotten 3x equals 144. So we know that this 3x equals 144, so that's going to be my angle measure, 144 degrees. Now I could go ahead and finish solving for x, okay? Part my river still, divided by 3 on both sides. Give you a chance to do that division. Okay, when you divided that out, you should have gotten 48. Okay. That's if I asked you what would be the value of x. Okay, so my angle measure there is 144, and I can check myself by doing 36 plus 144 to see if it equals to 180. Okay, all right. B part, it says find the measure of angle HJK. So we're trying to find the measure of this angle here. And we know it says it's 3x, and that's a minus, I think that's a minus 2. Okay, we're going to find the measure of HJK. All right, so now we know that these two angles here, angle HJK and angle KJL, are adjacent. Okay. Okay, and we also know that this is a 90-degree angle. All right, so if this angle is 50, then this angle has to be 90 minus 50, which would give me 40 degrees. So my answer would be 40 degrees. Okay, so now our next question says, one side of the roof of a doghouse shaped like an isosceles triangle. The measure of the angle at the top of the triangle is 130 degrees. Find the measure of each of the base angles. So here you see I've drawn an isosceles triangle. And we know the definition of an isosceles triangle means there's two equal sides. Okay, two equal sides, two equal angles. Okay, so now we know that all the measures of a triangle have to equal 180 degrees. Okay, so now let's work this out one step at a time. Okay, so if we have our top measure and we know that each angle has to add up to 180 degrees. So now we can take 180 and subtract 130, okay, and that would give us 50 degrees. So now that 50 means that both this angle and this angle together would add up to be 50, because that's what's left over. To figure out what 1 is, I would take that 50 and divide it by 2, which would give me what each of the base angles are. So it would be 25 degrees. Okay, and I can check myself by doing 25 plus 25 plus 130, and that should give me 180 degrees. Okay, so we just did angle relationships. In class tomorrow, be able to identify or classify congruent angles, vertical angles, adjacent angles, complementary angles, and supplementary angles.